Today we're going to talk about something that remains deeply unresolved in spite of assiduous efforts of a lot of people to resolve, which is gender politics and the role of women in society, and historically what the beginning is of our contemporary movements toward more gender inequality.
So today we are going to be talking with Rachel Stier. She's an award-winning essayist, writer, and critic, and the head of dramaturgy and the dramatic criticism program at the theater school at DePaul University. We are going to be talking about her latest book, which is called Betty Friedan, Magnificent Disruptor. It's a biography of the woman who wrote The Feminine Mystique, if that means anything to you. It was a 1963 bestseller that gave middle-class women a language for their unspoken dissatisfaction and oppression. The book struck a major chord, and Friedan, who was a writer and an activist, went on to found the National Organization of Women, which advocated for women's rights as human rights in the United States and elsewhere. And she sparked what's now known as the second wave of feminism. And for those keeping track, we are now in the fourth wave, and some people think post-feminism. So that's what we're going to be talking about today.
So good to have you with us this morning, Rachel. And for those who don't know, which would be everybody except Rachel or me, I was actually one of the people that you interviewed for your Betty Friedan book, because I had my own kind of odd encounters with Betty Friedan when I was, I guess, 10 to 12 years old, 9 to 13 in the 70s in the Hamptons via my mother and her community. So it's a real pleasure to talk to you today. I think one thing that I'm struck by, kind of how recent her life was and how distant her life feels. I don't know, in the sense of, you know, there's so much of what she wrote about and so much of the feminine mystique that has kind of entered our cultural DNA permanently, but her footfall and imprint seems oddly dissipated. I mean, maybe that's true of a lot of people. I don't know. Does that resonate with you, Rachel, when you were like writing about this and talking about it?
Absolutely. Yes. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm so thrilled. Her ideas about what feminism was dated much earlier. They were issues of equality and representation, pay equality, representation in politics, childcare, reproductive rights. Those were her issues, including her idea that the mainstream feminist movement had gone too far, that it was too radical, which was a constant cry of hers beginning in the late 60s and then on through the rest of her life. And I think that accounts actually in part for why she seems distant, because she rejected a lot of that radical feminism, which has become the dominant narrative of feminism. Second wave feminism is the idea of the sexual revolution and, of course, sexual identity politics as part of that. When I think about Betty, what I think about is that we haven't really achieved the very basic rights that she was interested in. We have made enormous strides on identity issues, right? That kind of representation. But in terms of childcare, reproductive rights, equal pay, representation in government, and that sort of thing, women have not really, they haven't done it.
I mean, so Zachary and I had someone on the podcast, Richard Reeves, that talks about the striking sort of pull ahead of women and girls as far as education, in terms of way more women and girls are now high school valedictorians, way more women and girls go into college. And if you take that argument generously, you know, as Zachary and I did at the time, I was saying, like, well, maybe this is where we're finally going to start to see the representation you're talking about, as far as representation in government and Fortune 500 companies and stuff like this, you know, like really like high points of society where I think it takes the longest to change. Tying into that, what I was going to ask you is that why you went back to her as far as a biography? Because she, you know, to Zachary's point about her dissipating in public consciousness, it's to the point where I was born in 1990 when Zachary was like, let's talk about Betty Friedan on the podcast. I was like, who's Betty Friedan? You know, like, oh. And then I realized she wrote The Feminine Mystique, and I was like, I can like put her into the slot now. But, you know, even you write in the book, like, she would probably be canceled nowadays. So yeah, why did you go back to her, particularly in this time?
10 years ago, which was the 50th anniversary of the Feminine Mystique, I wrote an article for the Chronicle of Higher Education Review, which is a newspaper for scholars, but it covers like the university beat or whatever. But they have this review, which is sort of more literary. And so I wrote about the 50th anniversary of the Feminine Mystique. And then I wrote about some other books that were coming out that had just come out at the time. One was Hannah Rosen's The End of Men. Another one was Naomi Wolf's book about her rediscovery in her 50s. And so my experience, I had never read The Feminine Mystique 10 years ago. And so I was reading The Feminine Mystique and I was just blown away by it. The writing is very kind of no holds barred, argumentative, punchy, and it makes for a great read. It also is irritating and in some places dated and so on and so on. But overall, the idea is women should have autonomy. And that was amazing. And then I was reading these other books and I felt that they either borrowed from Betty's argument without crediting her because they didn't mention her, or they argued with her in ways that I felt were kind of derivative or whatever. And so I wrote this piece, which was a defense of the Feminine Mystique. And a lot of people really liked the piece. Not long after that, I was asked to write this book. So it was a commission. It's not like I was thinking for many years, wow, I would really love to write the biography of Betty Friedan. But once I had written this piece and once I got into it, it was very exciting. I mean, it's different from my first 3 books, wildly different, but it does share one thing, which is that the women in all the cases, the women are kind of going against some public norms, even though the norms are very different in the different cases that I've written about. I always thought of that as a thread. So that's the basic story.
So I have a question for Emma in this, which is like, given that you were aware of the Feminine Mystique as a pivotal text or central text, I suppose. When you're reading and thinking about what Rachel has illuminated of Betty Friedan's life, does a lot of it feel like, oh, of course, meaning so much of what she pointed out in your growing up has been just accepted as a given? Or does a lot of it also feel strangely other?
Both. I would say both. I mean, I grew up with my mom raised me from the age of 12 and she was an entrepreneur. So the idea that like the point in my life was to get married and not go to college and be a housewife feels so alien to me that it's hard to imagine the world that Friedan occupied not too long ago, as we've spoken about on other episodes of the podcast, right? Like this wasn't too long ago in history that she had to point this out. I think it is a given, I think, for most people my age these days, and I think even more so for Gen Z and Gen Alpha, if you're a woman, that it's taken for granted that you're going to go and do something with your life other than have a family. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way towards having a family. At the same time, there is like this weird backlash that you see with like the traditional wives on TikTok and things of that nature. Rachel, I'm wondering if you could pick up on that thread as well, the backlash that we're seeing these days to those ideas.
Yeah, no, I agree, Emma. I agree with what you're saying. I think obviously on the one hand, there has been for younger women, the idea that you don't have to get married, right? That's an advance. There are different ways that you can live. But then I also think that there is this incredible persistence of these conventional, whatever you want to call them, 1950s ideas. I don't follow TikTok so much, so I don't know if I can comment on that. But I think there's other, like reality television, The Real Housewives, and so on. The Feminine Mystique and The Problem That Have No Name, which is what Betty called this idea that women were supposed to get married and sit around in the suburbs. It is about that. The book is about that, but it also, again, to me, it's about women having autonomy.
Well, the Feminine Mystique, it defines woman solely in terms of her sexual relation to man, as man's sex object, as wife, mother, homemaker, and never in human terms as an individual person, as a human being herself.
It's interesting. There was also one way one could look at this, and I was struck by this reading your book, that what Friedan had talked about as a particular constraint and straitjacket for American, maybe a little bit Western women, although we could have a whole side conversation about whether Simone Weil and Germaine Greer, who were coming out of a different European context, whether it was really the same framework or different.
Yeah.
But you also had multiple strains in the 50s where you had the man in the gray flannel suits, who the male version of it, like that there was a framework that men were supposed to be. And then you had the racial aspects. There was a framework that, you know, different classes of races were supposed to be. So in many ways, her book comes at this time where all of those frameworks are getting exploded. And even if her lens was gender, each of them, you know, roles were being blown apart.
Right. Yes, exactly. I mean, I definitely see the feminine mystique as being part of that same social critique world as the man in the gray flannel suit. Betty wanted women to live up to their potential, and she didn't see that happening. And it really upset her. And it came from a deep personal place, too. She was right in there just like being herself all the time. And there was no filter. And she wanted other women to do that, too. She didn't want women to be constrained by these ideas about gender. You know, the man in the gray flannel suit was accepted as a critique. But when Betty wrote The Feminine Mystique, the idea that there just should be a space to talk about women and how there were these gender roles and how they were guided by Freud and universities and so on, there wasn't a space for that. And so this persona that Betty developed, in my thinking, comes directly out of the fact that no one wanted to give her a space to talk about this. It was not considered to even be worthy of a conversation, really. I mean, I often think about her as screaming because no one was listening to what she was saying. And I guess I feel like women, this is, Emma, to your question again. I mean, although there have been some advances, I feel like women still are struggling to have that space just to talk about how to escape these constraints, whatever the constraints are in the media. I mean, like for example, the media. Okay, there's a lot of talk about like differently shaped bodies or whatever in, you know, fashion magazines. Okay, there's a lot of talk about that, but then you rarely see that.
I don't know if I entirely agree with that, to be honest. And I have to say, especially because I live in Greece now, and Greece is like 50 years behind kind of everything when it comes to comparing the US with Greece, and in particular with things like this that are cultural, like women's rights and where the conversation is around women. And what I see in Greece, I think, is like what probably was similar to what you saw in the United States in maybe the 80s or the 90s. Mm-hmm. But in the US, like I feel like my social media feed is like constantly filled with all different kinds of people that look different kinds of ways and are different ways. I am wondering like what constraints you still see operating on women these days that are not tied in with like Me Too and sexual politics, because that and maternal leave seem to be like the two biggies for me. But I feel like Friedan would not agree with that.
We don't have pay equity. We don't have reproductive rights in the States. We don't have childcare. There's huge ageism, especially around women, another of Betty's campaigns. I mean, I would say just those four for starters. I mean, we don't have representation in government. I mean, there's, you know, Betty thought that there would be a female president in like 1976, right? I mean, we haven't really done that well there. You know, I also would say Betty was really interested in unifying women from different political, this is more later, after the Feminine Mystique, when she co-founded NOW. Her idea about NOW was to unite women from different political perspectives, including conservative women, Republicans, and housewives, and also radicals. And a lot of women on the left did not want to do that. They only wanted to talk to radicals and progressives. And that's another reason why Betty parted ways with them. I mean, to me, that was extraordinary that she wanted to do that. And I don't think we've succeeded.
Betty wanted a big tent, but the people in the tent only wanted a big tent with people like them.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting question of the progress question is always challenging, right? Because we live in the moment that we live in, and we're faced with the constraints that we're faced in, and then that magical mystery to our question that's such a great parlor game because it will never be answered, of what would that person who is now dead feel about the future, which is now our present? Would they, if you plopped her down in 2023, would she go, wow, there has been movement here, there's been regress? Would it be just kind of a muddy mix of all of it? And to your ageism point, by the way, it's fascinating because ageism was so intense that her book on ageism nobody read, right? Like they just ignored it.
Right.
They still listened to a lot of other things she said, but nobody was very interested about Betty Friedan talking about age when she was
no
older.
one wants to talk about age, period, Zach, is what I would say. Like,
it's a perfect QED for the statement you just made.
Yeah.
But so I gather from what you're saying, Rachel, that you think that she would, and you certainly do, see their at best incomplete and at worst regress, right?
Well, certainly can you argue that reproductive rights is not a regret? I mean, and childcare, in the United States, we have nothing, I think Betty's response to that would be, okay, if we had passed the ERA, it would be a totally different picture. And that is a sort of also an answer to your question. I think she was devastated, like many other feminists of that time, that the ERA did not pass. And she considered that to be a huge failure. She hoped that it would galvanize the women's movement, like to regroup. And it didn't really do that.
For those listeners who don't know, ERA is Equal Rights Amendment, which I do feel some people probably don't know anymore. It's like another thing that's faded.
Yeah. Well, the Equal Rights Amendment was an attempt to put women's rights in the Constitution. And Betty thought that, and many other feminists, not just Betty, thought that really would solve a number of these problems that we're talking about. And so when it didn't happen, I think she began to get, upset about her legacy and also the legacy of the women's movement, and to really be thinking about, I don't know, like, what had they really accomplished in the 60s? And so I think if she were to come in on today, I think, she would be thinking about that. Even at the end of her life, she was certainly thinking about it. She was very upset that there was, in her mind, so much work to be done.
And most of the fight these days has gone on to sexual politics, as we were talking about before.
Yes.
I think there's definitely an organized pushback against reproductive rights in red states, but it is striking, to hear you speak about the lack of organization around maternal leave, childcare, as you say. There's just not a strong, like, I think when people think of feminists these days, they think about Me Too. They don't think about,
right,
let's close the gender pay gap by providing better maternal leave and options for mothers returning to the workforce.
Exactly.
I was going to ask you about another critique of Friedan that you raised in the book, that I believe an Israeli feminist raises to her on a trip to Israel that she takes. Whether she had made it possible for women to pursue their passionate journey, or had she merely displaced women's enslavement from housework to their professional functions. I particularly wanted to ask you about it because that is the number one pushback I see on social media when the Progress Network posts videos that are about any kind of feminist issue. Usually we do talk about, social attitudes, if women should work outside the home, how those have changed, or the gender pay gap, things like that. The number one pushback is women work outside the house and society has collapsed and the family has collapsed, and women now just have to be slaves just like men used to be. So what do you make of that?
Right. I mean, I think that critique is a really smart critique of Betty. And I think I wish I could be on a panel about it somewhere, or, see a panel or something. I mean, I think this is really maybe is not exactly in Betty's defense, but it's more a kind of explanation of what she was talking about. She wasn't really talking about women when she was talking about women going to work in the Feminine Mystique. It wasn't really about women going to work in factories or in some slave labor. And I think that reveals, her class origins, but it also reveals her individualism, which maybe these days is something of a dirty word. She really, again, it comes back to, she wanted women, yes, to be financially self-sufficient, but she also wanted them to to fulfill their potential, whatever that was. And, you know, she used herself as a model, right? I mean, that's the sort of, you know, whatever, some people consider that to be short-sighted, or that say that she was universalizing something that could not be reproduced, and make that sort of critique. But I actually find something kind of hopeful in her idea that women should try to live up to their full potential in the work world. Because I don't know, I feel like this idea of individualism these days, again, it's really kind of shoved to the side. And, you know, Betty was talking about how, you know, yeah, you have to compete. Yes, in capitalism, we live in capitalism. You have to compete there. And so, you know, if you're being an artist, you should just try and do, you know, everything you can to succeed. If you're being a media person, you should do everything you can. You know, you should not, her idea was you should not be relying on a man, your spouse, your partner, whoever, to bolster you up, and in some ways you should not be sitting back. You should have your own identity. This is another point of contention about the feminine mystique. She did not really think that working class women could lead the feminist revolution because they were overworked. That was her argument. They were overworked, right? And that's an argument that probably does not play very well on progressive social media either. But that was her argument, and she made it several times throughout the course of her life.
Which was another, I guess, critique of her and others in the 70s, that it was a white middle class movement predicated on the luxuries of time and bare necessities being taken care of or having been met. And which I think has become much more deeply entrenched in contemporary gender, sexual politics. The idea that we should all be self-actualized and make your own adventure is a luxury that many systems don't afford many people. And that's the pushback, right? And it's, I think, very entrenched today. And
very
there's
entrenched.
a kind of, you know, maybe one of the reasons that she has faded in some senses is that that's not in vogue anymore, right? Most people don't believe that all you have to do is find your own voice and your own courage and step out of the framework that you've been forced into. Like, it's not so simple. I think a lot of people today would say, not only is it not so simple, that's naive. Like, most people are literally structurally unable to do that, even if they were internally capable of doing that. What do you make of that?
I agree with you that the perspective today is, I don't know, anti-middle class in that way. And I agree with you that that's one reason, again, why Betty seems more distant. I guess also we have much less of a middle class than we did in the 60s, right? I also think, again, I think people are so much more tribal now. I think the idea of having a women's movement that somehow unites the concerns of many different women is practically unimaginable to me.
I agree with that. It's very hard to imagine Candace Owens linking arms with like the hardcore left. Yeah. With the, you know, the centrists, whoever they are now.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for the conversation today. You've had an interesting series of books now, from The Evolution of Striptease to one of the leading architects of our contemporary, I guess, gender politics, for lack of a better word. Before we go, is this a through line that you're going to continue? Do you have a next?
I don't know. I mean, I would like to write. I like writing about these contrarian figures, you know, and I think I can do that. And so I would like to write about a different contrarian figure, maybe even a man. If anybody would like to read that, I don't know.
All right, well, keep us posted on the hunt for the contrarian figure, the search for the contrarian, which we certainly, in our way, try to do gently at the Progress Network. But thank you so much for your thoughts and for your book.
Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it.